Good morning, Asia, and greetings wherever you may be tuning in from. I'm Elina Noor, Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute's office in Washington, D.C. Last month, in December 2021, the Asia Society Policy Institute launched a compilation of analyses taking stock of the South China Sea dispute. As anyone familiar with Washington, D.C. is aware, the South China Sea, indeed the whole regional landscape in Southeast Asia, is often overlaid by a US-China filter from within the Beltway. Within the report, we wanted to foreground the lens of Southeast Asia's frontline states in the South China Sea dispute, particularly the four Southeast Asian claimant states of Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, but also including Indonesia as an interested and affected party by way of the North Natuna Sea's exclusive economic zone overlapping with China's so-called 9-dash line. For more on these countries' basic positions, as well as their approaches to conflict management and dispute resolution in the contested waters of the South China Sea, please do check out the report on the Asia Society Policy Institute's website. Today, we're privileged to have in conversation three regional experts who also contributed to the report. Sumathy Permal is fellow and head of the Center for the Straits of Malacca with the Maritime Institute of Malaysia. Her research interests are in geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific and maritime security issues in the Indo-Pacific. Nguyen Hung Son is Vice President of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and Director General of the East Sea, the South China Sea Institute. His research focuses on major power relations, regional security governance, maritime security, and Vietnam's foreign policy. Evan Laksmana is Senior Research Fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Evan's research focuses on military change, civil-military relations, and international security. We'll unpack some of the developments that have unfolded over the past month that have implications for the South China Sea dispute. These include ASEAN being led by Cambodia as the new chair, Myanmar taking over as ASEAN-China country coordinator, Indonesia calling for regional coordination on the South China Sea, and the increased attention and shows of presence by external players such as the United States, Australia, Japan, and the United Kingdom. In fact, two US Navy carrier strike groups led by the USS Carl Vinson and the USS Abraham Lincoln have just begun operations in the South China Sea, as we are about to have this conversation. So by way of format, we'll kick off with some brief opening remarks of about 5 minutes each from our panelists. Then we'll go into two quick rounds of a back and forth with me. And then we'll turn to audience questions and comments on our social media accounts. So perhaps I can start with you, Evan, before turning to Sumathy and then Hong Son. Evan, tell us why Indonesia as a non-claimant state cares about the South China Sea dispute.
Thank you, Elina, and thanks for having me this morning. I think the key message here for Indonesia as a non-claimant is that obviously the South China Sea bears significant strategic importance because of how close we are to the South China Sea. So any instability in the maritime domain obviously affects us as well. But more broadly, beyond the immediate maritime security challenges that we also have to deal on a daily basis, whether it's illegal fishings or maritime incursions, beyond that, we are also very much concerned with the South China Sea in terms of how it's undermining or strengthening ASEAN's credibility. And Indonesia has always, never departed from its position that ASEAN is the cornerstone of its foreign policy. So whatever happens to ASEAN is something that Indonesia is also very much particularly concerned about. And lastly, the South China Sea is also an important litmus test for the bilateral relationship between Indonesia and China, as well as Indonesia's broader regional relationship. So to what extent the South China Sea disputes can be carefully managed by ASEAN and China, how much of Indonesia's relationship with China bilaterally, as well as Indonesia's relationship with Vietnam and Malaysia, is very much determined by what happens in the South China Sea in general. So for all these reasons, while Indonesia is not claimant state, in the sense that we don't stake a particular claim in any of the disputed islands or parts of the Paracels and Spratlys. We are very much concerned with what's going on in the South China Sea.
Great, thanks, Evan. Sumathy, what would you like to add to this?
Thank you, Elina. And as given in the report, in the executive summary, the South China Sea have persisted. The tension in the South China Sea has persisted for a long time. And for Malaysia, I think the situation is now even urgent with the Chinese seismic survey, militia movement, the presence of warships and the Coast Guard vessels, as well as the PLAF flight intrusion into Malaysia's exclusive zone. So Malaysia is a claimant in the South China Sea, and naturally the claims overlap not only with China, but also the other claimants in the South China Sea. For the purpose of just giving a broad summary of what I have given in the report, my section actually examines Malaysia's approaches and policies in the South China Sea. That firstly, its reliance on diplomacy and defense, as well as a legal mechanism to resolve the conflicting claim. And also the reports identify major risks impacting Malaysia and the region as a whole, while looking at how rule-based framework and the conduct of parties in promoting maritime cooperation in the South China Sea. So the fact that Malaysia had identified actually South China Sea as a potential flashpoint to be handled very carefully, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Foreign Policy Framework 2019 has actually alluded to this point and promotes or encourage close cooperation among the ASEAN member states and also the major powers in this relation. But one point that I would like to emphasize is Malaysia's approach as a defense, as the first line of defense for Malaysia's maritime claims are based on international law, also the UNCLOS, and also given Malaysia's interest, offshore economic interest in the EEZ and the continental shelf. I think these are some of the issues that Malaysia have to show that it is important to take a multi-pronged approach in the South China Sea. Thank you.
Thanks, Sumathy. Hung Son, would you like to summarize kind of the top line issues from your piece in our report?
Sure, Elina, and thanks for having me on this very interesting program. I share very much of what Evan and Sumathy have just said. I think the South China Sea issue, as it is known today, has evolved from the disputes over the rocks to the disputes over the resources, and now the disputes over the rules in the South China Sea. Now, because the nature of the South China Sea issue, as it is known, has evolved, then the so-called frontline states or the stakeholders has also changed. No longer only the territorial or maritime claimants are parts of the South China Sea issue, but whoever is affected by the disputes over the resources, and especially now the disputes over the rules that governs the South China Sea specifically, but more broadly, that governs the maritime sphere or the oceans, are part or are the party interested in the South China Sea issue. And therefore, in my piece, I argue that, of course, Vietnam is a very key stakeholders in the South China Sea, because we have rocks that are being disputed. We are involved in the resources disputes, but we also want to make sure that the rules that governs the South China Sea are in line with international rules, especially UNCLOS. And I think that there are other valid stakeholders who can be involved in making the rules South China Sea one that is internationally accepted and in line with that of the international communities. And therefore, I argued in my piece that the rising interest of other parties in the South China Sea are one that we should take advantage of. And ASEAN in particular needs to also take advantage of the growing interest of the international communities in making sure that the rules that governs the South China Sea is in line with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and also other internationally accepted rules. And that is, in a sense, a very core business of ASEAN, to make sure that this region is governed by rules and norms and not by any imposed rules by any other party. And that's, in a sense, is what I'm trying to say in my piece. Back to you, Elina.
Thanks. I like that. It's a really catchy phrase, rocks, resources, and rules. I feel like that could be the title of another report. Should have been the title of our report. So also maybe a hashtag that could trend. But thanks so much for that, Hung Son. Sumathy, I wanted to turn back to you and ask you a couple of tough questions, if I may, that I know are playing on everybody else's minds, but we don't often hear from Putrajaya. So hopefully you might be able to shed some light on what I'm about to ask. Let me start off with this. So contrary to, say, Vietnam, Malaysia is often seen as relatively low-lying in this dispute. It's quiet, its comments are often muted, and it usually wants to avoid confrontation with the hope that diplomacy will prevail even in times of clashes. And yet in the last few years, what we've seen is growing political, diplomatic, military, and law enforcement pressure for Malaysia as incidents of harassment at sea have only seemed to increase. Last year, even from tensions at sea, we saw those provocative overflights by the 16 PLA Air Force aircraft close to Malaysian airspace. So the threats are no longer now just in the maritime theater. I think you'll agree with me. So will Malaysia continue to be under the radar in its responses if these challenges continue to build?
I think Malaysia is no longer a low-lying party to the dispute. So as you mentioned, I think we have been very active. Not only now, I think even when the countries were negotiating the declaration of conduct of parties, I think Malaysia played an important role. And also Malaysia have consistently, very actively working on the COC document as well. One thing for sure is Malaysia is actively pursuing its interest to safeguard its sovereign interests and protect the features it claims. However, I do agree Malaysia is consistent in its approach to avoid confrontation.
Oh, I think we might have a frozen connection there.
Can you hear me?
There you are. Yes.
So even though we have high-level fishing intrusion and military and law enforcement presence in our EEZ, I think the response has been, the first response has been to resolve it diplomatically. But Malaysia have also deployed our jet fighters in response to the intrusion by, so I don't think Malaysia is taking a quiet approach in this sense. Very recently, our foreign minister also spoke about the possible change of Chinese attitude or Chinese voice on the South China Sea, who have, slowly taking a low key on the 9-line, but making more focus or pressing on the four shas, the Dongsha, Nansha, Zongsha, and the Zisha Islands concept. And he also alluded that both, whether it's 9-line or the 4 shas, it's still problematic and it is going to be complex. So I would summarize to say that the normal view that Malaysia have been very quiet in its approach is no longer applicable, especially on the South China Sea. And I think Malaysia is taking multi-pronged approach, defense diplomacy, legal efforts, as well as law enforcement, and also engaging China and also other claimants, including the non-claimants in the South China Sea. Thank you.
Thanks. Hung Son, if I can turn to you. I mean, I just pointed out that Malaysia's approach is in contrast to Vietnam's. Vietnam has obviously not shied away from confrontation in the South China Sea. And you mentioned some reasons for this in your paper, including domestic and diaspora expectations, as well as Vietnam's historical relations with China, of course. Does Vietnam's forward-leaning stance on the South China Sea issue box in Hanoi's policy options? Are there possibilities for off-ramping these tensions?
Well, I would say this. The South China Sea topic, I would say, is a lot more nationalistic in among the Vietnamese compared to other Southeast Asian counterparts. And there are several reasons for this. First, there are no other ASEAN countries that share both maritime border and land border with China compared to Vietnam. And therefore, the level of sensitivity of anything in relations to border disputes with China is magnified a lot more in Vietnam. Secondly, I would say there are no other ASEAN countries that had this historical depth of interactions with China, the way that Vietnam had, the number of invasions by China into Vietnam, and the number of times that Vietnam had to defend its sovereignty against China's invasion is very deeply in the mind of the Vietnamese people, to the extent that every Vietnamese is taught about that identity building the Vietnamese had to endure over the past relationship with China. And therefore, this is very deep into their mind also when it comes to South China Sea. Therefore, I think it's all very natural that when it comes to disputes in the South China Sea, Vietnam is very sensitive. Vietnam is very vocal and very upfront in defending its sovereignty. But to describe that it's very confrontational towards China, I think it's not quite accurate, because Vietnam, although it is very active, very vocal, and very forefront in defending its sovereign rights, I think the primary tool and primary approach of Hanoi's approach is still diplomacy and the legalistic. And Vietnam and Hanoi in particular still places plenty of emphasis on ASEAN and other multilateralism, such as the UN as a basis or as a foundation for its diplomatic approach to resolve the South China Sea issue. So is this approach boxed in Vietnam's policy option? I think not necessarily so. Vietnam, although is very active in defending itself, but I think Vietnam is also very flexible. And in fact, we have actually resolved many of our border disputes, particularly land border disputes with China, in a very fruitful manner. And even overlapping maritime claims have been very peacefully and very fruitfully resolved in the Gulf of Tonkin in a what is often referred to as a textbook resolutions of overlapping maritime claims entirely based on goodwills and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in the Gulf of Tonkin. So I think Hanoi has plenty of toolkits to deal with the South China Sea issue, and it's quite actually flexible, although it is very upfront and very vocal in defending its right.
Thanks for that clarification. Evan, you argue in your piece that for a number of reasons, Jakarta has avoided directly addressing China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, including in Indonesia's EEZ and the Natunas. You also write that there is a limited role for external players like the US and other European countries in resolving the dispute, or at least managing the dispute. Does the answer then to curbing China's bellicosity in the South China Sea lie with each affected ASEAN or Southeast Asian country and with ASEAN as a grouping itself? And if not, then what's the answer?
Right, thank you for that. First of all, yes, the short answer is yes, it does lie within the Southeast Asian claimants first. First of all, I think we have to separate between dispute resolution, as in the final maritime delimitation of who owns what and where. I think that is up to the claimant states themselves to negotiate. But secondly, there's also in the lead up to that process, we need to have proper tension management mechanisms. And this is what the COC was supposed to do. I think the COC was relatively successful in that regards, maybe the first 10 or so years. But I think in the last few years, we've seen the limitations of the COC in terms of tension management when one party, particularly China, has the upper hand in terms of military power as well as other strengths at its disposal. So right now, the question is what happens if the existing tension management mechanism is not sufficient or not robust enough that will allow a proper maritime delimitation process or talks to commence between China and the claimants. I do think then the answer does lie within the Southeast Asian states themselves. I think over the years, Southeast Asian states have tended, maybe consciously, maybe less so, to bypass the difficult task of clarifying their own claims under UNCLOS and negotiating those particular claims with its neighbors, excluding China, before actually just bypassing that problem to the COC process. Well, we don't want to clarify these claims before the COC brings us to a conclusion of what things should be. And I think now maybe it's a good time to revisit that standing assumption. Maybe it's time that the Southeast Asian states themselves figure out how to clarify their claims and negotiate maritime talks. I think this is what Indonesia and Vietnam has been doing. This is what Indonesia and Malaysia has been doing. Nobody says that you have to wait for the COC before you clarify your claims and then have your maritime delimitation talks. The presence of the COC process doesn't negate UNCLOS, right? As Hun Sen said, the rules still apply and UNCLOS still apply. So for me, if we are waiting for the COC to provide a robust enough tension management mechanism before we engage in maritime delimitation talks and clarifying of claims among the Southeast Asian claimants, we might be at a severe strategic disadvantage in the meantime. So for me, the difficult task now lies within the respective governments in Southeast Asia, the claimants in particular, to clarify their claims under UNCLOS and start their own maritime delimitation talks, regardless of what happens with the COC process.
Thank you. Well, we'll wait to see whether your advice is taken in the next few months. Sumathy, let me turn back to you and follow up on this question about external players. Malaysia has preferred to distance itself from the, let's say, embrace of the United States and its partners in the South China Sea dispute. Putrajaya has also voiced concern about growing militarization in the area, and without naming names, that charge has seemed to apply to both China and the US and all the other major powers showing presence and showing force in the South China Sea. Is this a significant policy difference between how Malaysia and the United States think the dispute should be handled? Or is it simply a matter of more effective communication that's needed between both parties?
Yes, of course, there is a significant difference between how the US and Malaysia view the South China Sea dispute and also the management of the dispute itself. primarily because of different priorities of both governments, such as the location, the proximity of the features of both governments, also the jurisdictional issues, as well as I think the more important issue here is the value it holds to Malaysia and US differently. Malaysia's relation with China is broader, encompassing economic interests and also social, cultural, and also historical bilateral relationship and so on. But at the moment, whereas US and China's interests are based on competition, and the background of is premised on great power rivalry. So there is a striking difference between how the US views the dispute should be managed, and Malaysia, how Malaysia is approaching the subject. And another key element is the Malaysia is party to UNCLOS, whereas the US is not a signatory to UNCLOS. So I think that also makes a big difference, because although, as you mentioned, as we discussed earlier, Malaysia is not opposing to freedom of navigation, but the way that the US conducts freedom of navigation could be, the interpretation of in entirety may be slightly different from what China and other states views freedom of navigation. So here, I think, but there are also similarities between how US and Malaysia views the situation, especially in relation to rule of law. And also both Malaysia and US are against cohesion, and also cohesion especially on smaller state. So the South China Sea is a strategic theater for the US, whereas for Malaysia, it's indirectly affecting our claims and also our relation as far as the oil exploration is concerned, the living and non-living resources in the South China Sea. So I think that is the major differences.
Thanks, Sumathy. Turning back to you, Hung Son. China has indicated an interest in concluding the Code of Conduct this year. Cambodia, as well as chair, has also expressed a similar desire, so it will leave a positive mark on its chairmanship. And in fact, this November will, as we all know, mark the 20th year anniversary since the DOC was signed in Phnom Penh when Cambodia was chair of ASEAN. Not much has changed since then, and yet everything has also changed. So what are your expectations of ASEAN concluding the COC this year with China, with Cambodia as chair of ASEAN, and with Myanmar as the country coordinator of ASEAN-China relations for the next 3 years?
Well, this can be seen as a great opportunity when we have both the chair of ASEAN as well as the country coordinator of ASEAN-China relations. Both are non-claimant states to South China's disputes. So this can be seen as an opportunity, because as non-claimant states, these countries can be seen as playing a neutral part, and also can be serve as an honest broker to try to move the process forward. Cambodia in particular has all the reasons to try to strike a goal in this particular era in their chairmanship, making up for what they were not able to achieve the last time. And also we can credit Cambodia for having the political will to push ASEAN on this front if it acts on ASEAN interest. Now the only problem is that Cambodia is not itself part of the UNCLOS yet. It has signed but not ratified UNCLOS. Therefore, it may not fully appreciate or understand the UNCLOS content of the COC that ASEAN is trying to achieve. Myanmar, although is seen as a neutral party and can play a role, but is in trouble at the moment. And I don't know if this year, Myanmar can fully function and can fully discharge its role as the country coordinator if the domestic political situation still prevent it from fully participates in ASEAN business. On the other hand, ASEAN is also in no rush to have a code of conduct concluded this year at any price. We have experienced a not less than perfect declarations of conduct on the South China Sea, which is a DOC. We do not want, ASEAN doesn't seem to want a less than perfect code of conduct, or just a code of conduct in its form, but not in its substance. ASEAN is patient enough to wait until it can achieve a substantive and effective code of conduct. And therefore, although ASEAN will not waste the opportunity to try to make progress on the code of conduct under Cambodia's chairmanship, I don't think ASEAN is in the rush to conclude it at any price this year. So we'll hope that ASEAN can achieve some substantive progress this year. But if it is not achieved this year, next year under Indonesia's chairmanship is also a great opportunities for ASEAN to make progress and also to arrive or to conclude the code of conduct also.
If not this year, then possibly next year. Indonesia has its plate full this year with G20 and T20, and there's a lot of domestic excitement about Nusantara being the new capital of Indonesia. But Evan, despite all this busyness that's going on with Jakarta, Indonesia has once again managed to innovate a new approach, or maybe not so new, but it's called for a February meeting of the 4 Southeast Asian claimant states, as well as Singapore, to coordinate an approach to what was reported in the press as disturbances in the South China Sea. So what should we expect from this meeting next month, in a few days' time, I guess, since we're at the end of January? And will this meeting cause more friction within ASEAN, since it excludes Cambodia as ASEAN chair, Myanmar as the country coordinator of ASEAN-China relations? It also excludes Laos and Thailand. So what of ASEAN unity?
Thank you for that. I think there's 2 separate issues here. One is the format itself, which is going to be spearheaded by maritime law enforcement agencies, particularly the Coast Guard. And the other one in terms of how this particular meeting may or may not spill over into the broader South China Sea dispute resolution or tension management mechanisms. On the second part, I'm less optimistic, I guess, mainly because the process that ASEAN's diplomatic community has committed to remains the COC. So far, we haven't seen anything else on the table in terms of the management of tension. That said, there are, I think, areas of cooperation where maritime law enforcement agencies in Southeast Asia can take the lead to reduce potential misunderstandings or accidents or incidents at sea that can happen separate from the COC process. And within this context, the idea was actually not designed to be an exclusionary idea of just 5 or 6 countries, but this idea was part of a longer conversation we've been having over the last several years to establish an ASEAN a maritime law enforcement and Coast Guard forum. So there is a bigger fish to fry, so to speak, which is the goal is not just to have these 5 or 6 countries, but the goal is to eventually have the ASEAN Coast Guard Forum established and initiated. It hasn't been easy. I think, as Hun Son mentioned, sometimes Cambodia cannot appreciate the full extent of the essence of UNCLOS. Sometimes other members are not very convinced that an ASEAN agenda has to be maritime-centric and therefore at the expense of the mainland Southeast Asian countries. So it hasn't been easy. But the ASEAN Coast Guard Forum idea remains on the table. And I think this is one effort that Indonesia is trying to jumpstart the process again. I think before the pandemic, there were discussions about potentially announcing the ASEAN Coast Guard Forum, I think late 2020 or maybe even mid 2021. But of course, the pandemic postponed all of that plan. So I wouldn't look at the idea as just an exclusionary Coast Guard meeting between 5 or 6 countries, but this is the beginning of a bigger step, which is to eventually have an ASEAN Coast Guard Forum of some kind, which I think is important because, as you pointed out, and as all the speakers pointed out, the interaction between maritime law enforcement is, in essence, a key flashpoint in the South China Sea as well. So taking a lead in this conversation on how to, I don't want to say to the point of regulating, but at least finding common areas of convergence in terms of managing behavior at sea, operational conduct, cooperation, coordinated patrols. These are things that we need more of, not less.
Thanks. So hopefully it'll be a good first step. Sumathy, you in your chapter on Malaysia wrote about some of the disconcerting developments related to the Coast Guard, and particularly Chinese Coast Guard law. And I wonder if you might have any comments on or expectations about this February meeting that Evan was just outlining, and whether you see it as a positive first step to maybe helping clarify positions within the ASEAN states before returning to the table to negotiate a more effective COC or coming up with a different approach to handling some of these tensions out at sea.
Yeah, I do think that the next month meeting and also focusing on law enforcement is very important, primarily because of we have a claimant, the biggest claimant, Chinese Coast Guard, having some, announcing new laws of the Coast Guard new laws, and some of the details of the law would definitely be a challenge to other law enforcement agency in the vicinity. For example, China is given the Coast Guard is given the authority to fire, for example, on any other law enforcement that deemed to be imposing a challenge to Chinese area, and Chinese area in that description is referring to the entire 9-line. So which will definitely involve the features or the operating areas of other, including Malaysia. So here it is important that the Coast Guards of Southeast Asia and also China, and perhaps the Coast Guard of other non-claimants, to sit together and thrash out what are the anticipated problem, and taking the best practices of other Coast Guards, especially on the items like firing, the types of weapons will be used, and so on. So I look forward. In fact, that is one of the recommendation I made in my final chapter, that I said that CBM and especially the Coast Guard Forum is very important and pressing issues for China and also the claimants. Thank you.
Hung Son, you mentioned that ASEAN is not in a rush to conclude a COC just for the sake of concluding a COC. And yet the number of incidents of harassment at sea have increased. So in a way, there is a disjuncture between what is hoped for with the COC and this, perhaps some would say, illusion that we have time on our side in ASEAN with the reality of what's going on at sea. How do you connect this, on the one hand, this parallel idea that we have time, and on the other, the reality that actually things are starting to heat up in the South China Sea? Do we really have this time to wait on a meaningful, effective COC with teeth?
Well, I think on the one hand, we should try our best to try to achieve an early conclusion of the COC. I do not deny the need to have an early conclusion. But on the other hand, we also need a quality code of conduct, one that is really going to be effective in managing incidences and preventing incidences on the South China Sea, and not one that is just going to be effective, or not one just going to be on the paper and without full observance by the forces on the ground. So I think in order to achieve that, or in order to bridge the gap that you mentioned between what progress being made at the diplomatic table and the factual incidences on the ground, I think it's very important to have the people, the forces on the ground, to actually be involved in the COC process. And that is the Coast Guards, that is the fishery monitoring agencies, that is even the organizations representing the fishermen and other stakeholders that are actually on the ground. Are they involved in the COC negotiation process? Are their interests, are their views being listened to or taken into account into the COC negotiation progress? I doubt that is the case. And I doubt we have that full involvement of those stakeholders in the process. Unless and until we have all of them on board, then we are not going to have a code of conduct that is going to be fully implementable and fully effective. And therefore, I think forums such as the Coast Guards Forum, or the interactions between the Coast Guards now within ASEAN, but also can be expanded to include other stakeholders in the region, for example, that of China, is going to be necessary in order to arrive at the full understanding and a actual code of conduct or code of behavior between those forces, which is the key to maintaining an incident-free South China Sea.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really important point there, Hung Son, about the involvement of the people who are actually affected by the dispute. And it's not just a dispute among states, it involves the fisher folk as well. And I want to pose the same question to both Sumathy and Evan. There is the idea, especially in Malaysia, that the South China Sea dispute and its discussions are really the preserve of the policy elite. But more and more, we hear the gripings of the actual fisher folks who are having their livelihoods affected by the dispute at sea. Do you see, Sumathy, in Malaysia, more of an effort to get the voices of these people who depend on their livelihoods or what's going on at sea? Do they have voices in the policy-making sphere? And to you, Evan, similar question, is there outreach to the fisher folk to determine where their position should be in kind of the larger strategic policy-making decisions that Jakarta makes with regard to the South China Sea and IUU fishing? So perhaps I can start with Sumathy and then I'll turn to Evan.
So the issue faced by fishermen, it's very sad and also threatening to those livelihood of the fishermen. But in Malaysia, I think there's a lack of awareness, or I won't say as much as we hear from Indonesian fishermen or the Vietnamese fishermen. There are one or two reported cases or reporting in the newspaper of the coast of Sarawak of fishermen having problem to deal with huge Chinese militia vessels, and also not only Chinese vessels, the larger problem for Malaysia's fishermen is also the illegal fishing vessels from Vietnam. So I think, but not really from the fishermen, but our law enforcement have also faced similar issues. And but these are being discussed at the policy level. But I think there is a need to engage more the fishermen fishing community in the South China Sea to hear what are the actual issues, whether their livelihood has been really taken by other intruders, or whether they have any alternate options to deal with the depleting fishing resource for us in Malaysia. So I think a lot of engagement is needed, and as at this time, I think there is a lack of awareness, and also, we have not really engaged the fishing community, but it is important to do so.
Evan.
Yeah, thank you. Are they involved, the local stakeholders? Yes, they are, but for not the reasons that we would like to. I think they're not a part of the discussion when it comes to like the COC or even maritime delimitation talks. They're certainly not being thoughtfully considered in that context, but they are being considered within the context of Indonesia's own problems with maritime governance, particularly on the domestic side. And there's two issues here. One is the fishery industry and coastal communities. And then the other one is in terms of law enforcement. Now, in terms of law enforcement, these things obviously a key point, because from time to time, whether or not the local fishing community ventures out in the exclusive economic zones and potentially clashes with those from Vietnam, Malaysia, or China, it certainly caused from time to time an international incident, if you will, right? So it's not just localized in that sense. But the solution from the government so far has been kind of very much limited and localized. So one example that they try to do this is, rather than improving the political and economic conditions of the local fishing communities around Natuna, for example, they actually brought or tried to bring fishermen from Java, about at least 2 weeks away by boat, to Natuna to fish in the area, because there aren't big enough fishing vessels around Natuna to have regular activities in the exclusive economic zone. So they actually try to migrate or transport Javanese fishermen with bigger ships and vessels to the North Natuna Sea. And this, of course, creates problems that we haven't really worked out. Who's going to pay for it? The potential for marine environmental damage, and of course, the potential for clashes with fishing vessels from Vietnam, Malaysia, or China. So the solutions that the government has put forward so far in terms of involving local fishing community has been localized and very much counterproductive. On the other hand, the local governments and elite representing these fishing communities have also become a source of confusion, if not problem, with the government in terms of the maritime governance, because, for example, one local government around the North Natuna Sea proposed that they get to operate their own coast guard. So these are things that actually might complicate the situation as far as law enforcement is concerned. But the key point is that Indonesia, I think, does need an overall and a key overarching framework to overhaul its maritime governance structure domestically, and that includes making sure that the fishing communities are a key stakeholder in the process, even if they're not a key stakeholder in terms of maritime delimitation or the COC process.
Yeah, I think very often, those of us who study state-to-state behavior forget about the actual people who are impacted the most by the decisions that policymakers take. Hung Son, I want to turn back to you and again pick up on what you had earlier mentioned about external players. And I want to contrast that with the maritime delimitation challenges that even the ASEAN claimant states have not managed to work out amongst themselves. So on the one hand, the claims in the South China Sea are not just between Southeast Asian claimant states and China. Even the ASEAN claimant states have yet to resolve their own claims. But on the other hand, we also have kind of the pressures of external players wanting to be involved more and more in trying to at least manage the tensions at sea. Do you think that these two processes can be handled in parallel fashion? Or do you think we should prioritize amongst the ASEAN claimant states resolving our own territorial claims before involving the external players?
Well, that's a very good question, Elina. I think these processes can go in parallel. On the one hand, neighboring states should, wherever involvement of external players should by themselves try to resolve their overlapping maritime claims and bilateral issues arising from there. Should be the business of those states with adjacent coastlines or opposite coastlines or with overlapping maritime claims. So there's no question about that. However, the involvement of external players, which in my view, they have legitimate interest in this region in trying to uphold international law, uphold the international environment that preserve the rule of law. And in particularly in the South China Sea, that would be the preservations of the United Nations on the law of the sea. These are also very important background, which serves as the solid foundations for the states involved to base on to resolve their overlapping maritime claims. Also, the external players can play a very constructive role in helping the region manage issues that are regional in nature, which they themselves can or may not have the capability or the technological capability in order to resolve. For example, managing the degrading environmental environment or the degradation of the nature of the fishery resources, or other aspects of oceanic governance, which is arising. These are issues that the region have not yet had the mechanisms or the resources to deal with, which can benefit from external parties' involvement. So in other words, I think the roles of countries like Japan, India, Australia, the European Union's nations can be beneficiary not to intervene into the bilateral processes of resolving maritime claims in the region, but trying to consolidate the legal foundations for those processes to happen, and also to provide the technical assistance to the countries in the region to manage regional problems in order to create the kind of favorable environment for a peaceful management and resolutions of the overlapping maritime claims.
I think, yeah, it's very tricky, as you pointed out. But, you know, Sumathy, in your chapter, I'm actually going to pick up from Sumathy's writing and turn this question to Evan. Sumathy was very upbeat about ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook, and in helping to manage some of the tensions at sea. Given that the outlook was shepherded by Indonesia mainly, and supported, of course, by the rest of the ASEAN member states, I'm going to turn to Evan and then turn back to Sumathy for a response. Evan, do you see a real role for ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific in trying to calm some of these tensions at sea?
In its current form, the short answer is no. I think the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific was initially designed as a way to provide some agenda setting capability for ASEAN when they engage or being engaged by the extra-regional powers on the Indo-Pacific. In simple terms, okay, we could not talk about the Indo-Pacific without having an ASEAN version of Indo-Pacific, because when we talk to them, to the US, to Australia and others, we have to follow their framing and their agenda. So having the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific brings us back to the ability to set the big framework in terms of conversation. But does that actually change anything on the ground? No, it doesn't. It doesn't affect anything in terms of the ZOC process. It doesn't affect anything in terms of how Beijing sees the problem or change its behavior. Number two, all of the things are included within the AOIP are things that we've already agreed on over the last 10, 15 years. These are not new path-breaking initiatives. And in fact, I think some ASEAN member states are ready to move on from the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Only Indonesia is still now insisting on finding an implementing framework for the AOIP. And we will have to see how that turns out. I think that may turn out to be a part of Indonesia's chairmanship in 2023. But as it stands, these are not new areas of cooperation, whether it's maritime, economic, SDGs. These are all things that we already agreed upon. The principles included are also things that are have been set in numerous ASEAN documents and charter provisions and all that. And lastly, if there is a potential workable option within the AOIP, it has to do with the East Asia Summit. To what extent can we link up, for example, the East Asia Summit with IORA? To what extent can we further institutionalize the East Asia Summit as the prime strategic forum for a leaders-led discussion? These are things that I think are sort of underexplored, but it's there if we want to. But right now, I think the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific is just that. It's an outlook, it's a way of looking without actually doing anything yet.
Sumathy, do you agree?
Yeah, Evan got a very good point. Actually, the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook was a response to the Indo-Pacific strategies, proponents of Indo-Pacific. Every country, US, Japan, Australia, India, EU, separately now UK, and also France, all these countries have got their Indo-Pacific strategy, and some are focused on strategic outlook, some are focused on inclusivity, some are focused on free and open access to all. So I think Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN were under some sort of they had some obligation to at least to respond to the emerging Indo-Pacific concept, hence the outlook. But I do agree that there's not much efforts or progress, and it is the Indo-Pacific itself on a bigger scale is lacking on functional cooperation. It is all covered in the outlook that it has to be transparent, inclusive, it has to have good governance and so on. But how do we implement it? Like Ivan said, we have all this under ASEAN-China's bilateral relation, under AMF, ARF, and so on. But things have gone from bad to worse on the ground. You know, the increase in military activities and fishing issues. So now the question is whether the Indo-Pacific concept or the Indo-Pacific framework can support ASEAN or Southeast Asia to be stable and peaceful. Hence, we need to discuss this further.
Thanks, Sumathy. I don't want to end on a negative note, so I will give all three panelists a chance for a 30-second takeaway on what they hope to see for the coming year with regard to the South China Sea dispute. I'll start with Hung Son, and then go to Evan, and then finish off with Sumathy. Hung Son, all yours.
Well, I will follow up on the point of the Indo-Pacific. All of the vision of the Indo-Pacific presented by key players out there point to ASEAN centrality, point to the role of ASEAN as a very important stakeholder of the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, I think in the year to come, I hope ASEAN is going to regain its centrality on the South China Sea issue as the key manager of the South China Sea. And it's going to inject itself by having a very clear, very consistent position articulated on matters pertaining to the South China Sea, and to take charge of the COC negotiating process and make progress on it. And that's what my expectation on ASEAN's role on South China Sea in the year to come.
Great, thank you, Hung Son. Evan.
Well, my expectation is that ASEAN will do what ASEAN does, but I think it's time for the regional governments to figure out how to address their own problems, whether in the South China Sea or beyond, regardless of ASEAN. I think only when we consider the difficult task for the regional governments, rather than buck passing the responsibility to ASEAN, can real progress be made.
Thanks for that reality check. Sumathy, final word.
So my expectation is 2022 is still, we are ASEAN countries are still dealing with the pandemic, with the new variant. And I think the focus will be on being a resilient society, and health security will be on the agenda. So those claimants in the South China Sea, they also need to understand that the responsibility lies on us to ensure that the development on the ground does not turn into a bigger problem. And of course, the COC is something that China desired for. Whether the COC is concluded or otherwise, I think ASEAN-China bilateral engagement on the South China Sea should continue. Thank you.
Hung Son, Sumathy, Evan, thank you so much for your time and insights. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in. A recording of this conversation will, of course, be made available on the Asia Society Policy Institute's website, as well as on our social media accounts. We hope to see you again in our future webcasts. And until then, take care and stay safe.
Thank you, Elina. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you.
Bye, Sumathy.